I want to talk about this sick individual. Let's go.
Was Muhammad a pedophile? The answer is no. But this is the offensive question asked in Crete these days, particularly on social media, and by Christians. Missionaries, in my experience, with this accusation that Muhammad was a paedophile. And this in particular is because...
First off, it is not taunting Muslims to say that. One reason why that's not is because the Christians who you're talking about did not just make that story up. Okay? I thought for a long time, as a Muslim myself, that Christians made up that story. I remember when I was 16, and I regret it to this day, how I responded to the Christian who was asking that question, because actually they weren't Christian. Now that I think of it, they were I think they were interested in the religion, but they heard what the Hadith said about the Prophet, and of course they had questions, and I didn't even know what they were talking about, because I'm a Muslim who doesn't follow the Hadith. The Hadith is bullshit. Let's just be honest. The Quran specifically speaks against the Hadith. It does. It says that you cannot follow any book after the Quran, and specifically that the last religious scripture, the last sacred scripture, the last revelation is the Quran. You cannot follow any book after the Quran. Otherwise, you might as well be a Baha'i. I don't understand how these people who believe in the Hadith somehow think they're still Muslim when you don't even follow the Quran. You don't follow the Quran, because if you followed the Quran, you wouldn't follow any other book besides the Quran, but instead you're following a Hadith who specifically says that Muhammad was basically a pedophile. That's what you're basically doing, because that's the thing. You're saying that Christians are the ones who came up with this lie. No. It was specifically people who believe in the Hadith who push this lie. And then Muslims who actually are Muslim, who never even heard of this, get confused because they're like, where the heck did you get that from? On the Christian end. And we don't even know how to address it, because if we don't read the Hadith, and we don't even know the Hadith is spreading these lies about the Prophet, how are we to know? We think instead that the Christians are making up those lies. No, the Christians are not. They're just getting misinformation from people who believe in the Hadith, who want to lie on the Prophet because there's a lot of pedophilia in their community. Now, this sick individual is going to try and use excuses as to why it's okay to have sex with a 9-year-old. You have to understand, we are talking about a religious figure, okay? Muhammad was supposed to be a moral person. Prophet Muhammad, plus peace and blessings upon him, was supposed to be a moral individual. It doesn't matter what society was doing at that time. It matters that he was a moral individual who was a prophet, okay? So obviously he was no pedophile, especially when the Quran specifically speaks against pedophilia. You have to be of a mental capacity to mature mental capacity to specifically engage in sexual relationships, to engage in marriage, to choose marriage. You have to be in an emotional mindset that is mature. That clearly isn't at 9, it isn't at 8. People think that it just because you have physical reproduction and the ability to reproduce, that means anything. It doesn't. But let's continue.
Because of his marriage to Aisha. But when you look at the historical evidence presented in context, we find that this allegation is in fact baseless, and that's what I intend to do now, briefly. Scholars disagree concerning the age of Aisha when she married the Prophet, the earliest estimate being that she was 9 years old. This means that the marriage contract was ratified after Aisha reached puberty, which was...
So, first off, as far as historians specifically have actually said that she was probably around 17 to 19 years old. The Hadith is the only source that is specifically saying that she was 9. And the reason they're saying that she's 9 is because they're saying there's a narration where she says she was 7 to 9 years old or something. Okay, so let's give reference of what the Hadith is. Okay, I explain that the Hadith is bullcrap, right? The reason why the Hadith is bullcrap is because it's supposed to be of the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, and Aisha, right? And a lot of other people, right? And these people were around in 632. He died in 632. She was, I don't know what age she was at that time, but she was around in 632, okay? And specifically, the Hadith and the people who created the Hadith created it in 800 AD. So they never met Aisha. They never met Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him. They didn't meet their friends. They didn't meet anybody. They just came up with a whole bunch of bullshit to put in a book that was already discredited by the Quran, and said that this is a good correlation in saying this is a narrative of what the prophet had said. Now, they did that because if you look at the Hadith, it has a lot to do with the culture, the cultural expectations of the Arabs, not specifically to do with anything religious or moral, but it has to do with their customs and what they want to make legal among their culture. He's going to explain that right now.
Considered adulthood in ancient Arab society. A marriage between an older man and a younger woman was customary and socially appropriate in that era, considering that such marriages were an important means of survival in a harsh desert environment and that people had a much lower life expectancy than they do have today. Professor Colin Turner of the University of Durham here in England, he is an expert on Islam in the Middle East Studies Department, explains the context of the Prophet's marriage. He writes, "A marriage between an older man and a young girl was customary among the Bedouins, as it still is in many societies across the world today. It was not unheard of in Muhammad's time for boys and girls to be promised to each other in marriage almost as soon as they were born, particularly if the union was of direct political significance to the families concerned. However, such marriages were almost certainly not consummated until both parties had entered adulthood, which Arabs in the 7th century tended to reach at an earlier age than Westerners today. It is highly unlikely that Muhammad would have taken Aisha into his bed until she was at least in her early teens, which was wholly in keeping with the customs of the day and in context not in the least improper." That's Professor Colin Turner, Islam, the Basics, published by Routledge, 2006, pages 34 to 35. The scholar of religions, Karen Armstrong, she's a very distinguished and accomplished publisher on.
So, specifically, as stated here and explained, when it comes to their culture, that's why they said that. That's why they specifically tried to say that he was with her at a very young age, because their society specifically does that normally. They have a pedophilic tendency, and of course, the person speaking is very pedophilic because he's referencing a 9-year-old to be a young woman. But that's beside the point. I'm focused on what I'm talking about here. It obviously is quite clear that the only person and the people claiming that it had to do with pedophilia or that he was with someone while they were 9 years old or whatever were specifically people who practiced that, who wanted to have access to 9-year-old children, to have access to children who had periods. And that's the thing. Obviously, if you're a religious person and you have morals, you would know that obviously, even if someone has a period, that does not define whether they're an adult or not. You cannot make decisions from a very underdeveloped brain that is completely not, fully mature. God makes humans, okay? So God knows that He made humans' brains fully developed in their 20s. Obviously, 9, 7, 3, which are ages that children get their periods, by the way. It's not just teens like people think. You can get your period as early as 3. Lena Medina specifically got her period at 3 years old. These kind of sick individuals would specifically think it's okay to have sex with a 3-year-old just because they have a period. You're a fucking animal, and you fucking deserve to be locked up. My point in this is that specifically, these type of people try to lie and specifically say that he specifically was married to somebody who was 9 years old and had sex with her at a very young age because they wanted to normalize what they do, basically, through religion. And so they added the Hadith and the scripture of the Hadith to try and say that's a religious scripture in order to try and say that it's totally legal and moral to have sex with 6-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 9-year-olds, anyone who goes into puberty, basically. And I can tell you, I've gone through puberty at 6. I had my period at 8, so I know. Obviously, you can have a body that's fully developed, and your brain's not going to fully develop with it because your brain is still on the same page as other people your age. And I mean, it's tough enough, honestly. I'll tell you from personal experience, it's tough enough for people like myself who are going through early puberty, precocious puberty, to live life, okay? Than to let alone have people say that it's legal to rape people like myself because we went through puberty earlier than everybody else. Because people are always trying to treat you like a teen and trying to treat you like you're an older person than what you are when you're just a little 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old. You don't deserve to be treated like you're not innocent anymore just because you grew breasts. Like, your mind is still very innocent, and your mind still doesn't know a lot of things and cannot process a lot of things that teenagers can process. Periods don't make your brain mature faster than other people. It doesn't. It just doesn't. So that's one thing I was just trying to say here. The people who stated that he was with somebody at 9 specifically never even met him. And other accounts, as far as the historians, they've specifically said that she was probably between 17 and 19. Some have estimated she may have been 15, but they have generally estimated she's within that range as far as consummation, 17 to 19 years of age. So I just get annoyed by people trying to say that was an accurate account when this is an account that specifically took place over 200 years after he was dead, and they did not speak to any of the people he was that were his direct followers at the time, because they were all dead. So anyway, continue.
On Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism. In her biography of the Prophet, writes, "There was no impropriety in Muhammad's betrothal to Aisha. Marriages conducted in absentia to seal an alliance were often contracted at this time between adults who were even younger than Aisha. This practice continued in Europe until well into the early modern period. There was no question of consummating the marriage until Aisha reached puberty. when she would be married off like any other girl. End quote. That's from her Muhammad, a Prophet for Our Time, published by HarperCollins. Interestingly, Christian tradition records a similar marriage between, can you guess, the much older Joseph to the young Virgin Mary. And this is even more extreme. The Catholic Encyclopedia says of Joseph, a year after his wife's death, as the priests announced through Judea that they wished to find in the tribe of Judea a respectable man to espouse Mary, then 12 to 14 years of age, Joseph, who was at that time 90 years old, went up to Jerusalem among the candidates. That's the Catholic Encyclopedia in New Advent website, 1995. So she may have been as young as 12 and he may have been as old as 90. Christians cannot possibly use the Prophet's marriage to condemn Islam, for if they do so, they would have to condemn Joseph, Saint Joseph, the husband of the Virgin Mary, and I can't imagine they would ever do.
As far as that whole situation, for me personally, people make estimates all the time in the Bible that are obviously not true. That's why the Bible needs to stop guessing. But then again, I'm a Muslim, so I don't believe in the Bible. So, like, when you're talking about that, that's really not going to make me think, oh, what? I don't understand. What do you think I'm going to think of the Bible saying something like that? The Bible also says other things that are scientifically incorrect. You know, they guess too much and then they make themselves look stupid. You know, that's not the point. You know, as a person who only believes in the Quran, I can look at people who believe in the Hadith as very sick individuals if they actually believe that specifically 9-year-olds can consent to sex. If you believe that 12-year-olds can consent to sex, yes, you're very sick. I don't care what time period, okay? I don't, because you're saying morally it's okay. Okay, you can say someone made a mistake, okay? Somebody made a mistake and they were with someone who was 14, 12, young, very young, underage ages, especially 12, 11, 10, so forth. You can have that idea. But even if you did, you're basically having this idea that specifically that it's a situation that is morally okay. And that is not true. It is not morally okay. And that's why it's such a big deal to me. Because in this case, we're talking about Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad is a man of religious conviction, okay? He is a prophet. He, was a messenger. And specifically, he would have the right moral code to know not to have sex with underage girls like that, especially when the Quran specifically speaks against this behavior. There's nowhere in the Quran that specifically says you have to have your period. It doesn't. It specifically does not say you have to have your period to marry. It doesn't. It says you cannot have your period. You can never have your period. You could have delayed puberty. You could have a situation where you don't get periods. You could be too old to get periods. It could be any of those things. Periods were not the point of actually the reason why you can get married or not. People are thinking of it in a reproductive level, but that's just your purpose, like your reason for marriage, okay? But that's not specifically what the Quran permits. The Quran specifically permits you to specifically marry whether you are a person who is fertile or not. But mental maturity is a part of it. Mental maturity is what makes it where you can choose to marry or not. You cannot have mental maturity at 10. You can't have mental maturity at 11. You can't have mental maturity at 12. look at the development of your brain. Your brain is not fully developed until you're in your mid-20s. Quite clearly, your brain is not fully developed at 10 or 12, half that age, less than half that age. So you can't say that there's mental maturity there. So my point is in this, it's just like specifically, personally to me, you guys saying that this is specifically a situation that would have to do with cultural expectations that would nullify the idea that we're talking about religion here. You're talking about cultural expectations. Cultural expectations have nothing to do with religion. And in the Quran, it specifically says that cultural expectations have nothing to do with religion. What's moral and what's right has got nothing to do with what your fathers did before you. It specifically says that in the Quran. So, you can't tell me what is culturally expected, what's socially expected, because the moral code that is given in the Quran specifically speaks against this. Muhammad is the messenger, and he specifically is a messenger who revealed the Quran specifically. So you would think if in the Quran it specifically says that this is wrong, then how the heck did he do such a thing? You get what I'm saying? It wouldn't make sense, basically, is my point here. And so that's why I'm saying that the only source here is people who are just trying to make good of what they do when it's specifically something that was outlawed by the Quran. Continue.
That.
I'm going to just let this go through and finish it off.
But interestingly, marriage in Islam is not simply about sex. It's a spiritual agreement based, as the Quran puts it, on love and mercy. In Surah 30, verse 21, it reads, "He, God, created spouses from among yourselves for you to live with in tranquility. He ordained love and kindness in you." What God has ordained for marriage. Ratifying a marriage contract does not necessitate sex. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Prophet had sex with Aisha before puberty. And that's a crucial point. And just to emphasize that point, just to quote a couple of Western sources talking about the age of consent and marriage in the West, quoting from a textbook, Adolescence, Sexuality and the Criminal Law, a Multidisciplinary Perspective. It's a handbook discussing the regulation of adolescent sexual behavior and provides lots of useful historical information. It's mainly written for the legal profession, for those interested in issues of criminality and the sexuality of children and adolescents. And it says on page 25, age of consent throughout history has usually coincided with the age of puberty, although sometimes it has been as early as 7. Early on, age of consent was a familial or tribal matter and only became a legal one in the Greco-Roman period. The Roman tradition served as the base for Christian Europe as well as the Christian church itself, which generally essentially based upon biological development at 12 or even 14, but continued to set the absolute minimum at 7 years old. And then another quote here, traditionally across the globe, the age of consent for sexual union was a matter for families to decide or a tribal custom. In most cases, this coincided with signs of puberty, menstruation for a woman and pubic hair for a man. And then coming particularly to the United States, which really surprised me, in the 19th century, the usual age of consent in the United States was, believe it or not, 10 years. In the state of Delaware until the mid-1960s, it was 7 years. In A Guide to America's Sex Laws, the authors note, the law governing the age of consent has changed dramatically in the United States during the 20th century. Most states guide a stage of consent. In 19th century, the usual age was 10 years. Now, this is stated by Richard A. He was Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals. So that was his statement of the affairs. And then coming to Britain, according to British common law, during the colonial period, the age of consent was 7. Today, we are astounded that girls of this age were assumed to know enough about sex or about sin to make such a decision competently. But nevertheless, that was the reality.
So that's what constantly is done with these type of individuals, is they constantly try to normalize their pedophilia. And it's like, to me, in my perspective, it's like, okay, so just because there were pedophilic laws at one point in life, that means we need to continue to perpetuate them. We need to continue to not protect children and basically, say that pedophilia is somehow morally okay, morally legal. It should be a-okay to do because long ago they didn't protect children. If that was really the case, then we should definitely get rid of the laws we had on rape as far as black women. Reason why is because just like in 1950 or so, it wasn't very long ago, it used to be very legal to rape black women. So I guess that means that we should go back to those days and remove all rape laws